Welcome back, friends and fellow lovers of obscure survival horror titles. Today I put together a list of some of the most genuinely odd and underappreciated games in existence, and don't you worry, we've also got a few terrible ones in there just to make sure we cover the entire spectrum. Without a doubt in my mind, this video is bound to have at least a few games that you've never heard of before, and if it doesn't, I guarantee that I will personally give you 10,000 US. So keeping that legally non-binding promise in mind, let's dive into the list. We've covered a lot of varying quality in terms of these RE clones, and I think the only terrible, definitely would not play it again level game so far has been the PAL-only release of Men in Black. So I guess you might assume it's time for another stinker, and, well, you'd be right.
I'm sorry, Dad. Now we can never be together. You must remain here forever.
The Crow's been making the rounds on the internet for a while now, but I think the angry video game nerd is to blame for its more recent infamy, and having played it myself recently, I can say that a majority of that video was hammed up to fit the guy's character, which, in fairness, you probably should assume. Now, that doesn't mean this is some kind of unappreciated gem or anything. It's bad, but it's just not the kind of over-exaggerated bad the nerd portrays it as. But before we get into that, let's get into the story, and trust me, we won't be here very long. You ready for this? Okay, here we go. You're a guy who was murdered, along with your girlfriend, and then you come back for revenge. Alright, now that the story's been covered in a single sentence, let's talk about gameplay.
One fix.
And I hope you're ready for this long, detailed analysis. So here we go. You start the game at a bar, and continue forward beating people up until you beat up the people who killed you. Literally the easiest video game I've ever had to describe to anyone. And you'd think I might be pleased with controls being handled with my tried and true, favorite, very much loved tank control method, but there's some kind of delay baked in here. I'll press up on the D-pad, and a second later my guy on screen will begin his startup animation for walking, which is not a short process. And that delay makes it feel like you're playing in slow motion sometimes, although I probably should mention that other times you actually will be playing in slow motion thanks to the game not running well when more than two people are on screen along with a few 3D objects like, I don't know, weapons or environmental stuff. When a bad guy approaches you, you'll automatically put your set up, and from there you can do certain moves with button combinations like an uppercut with forward plus circle or a spin kick with left and square. On top of that, you have this neato backflip that serves no real purpose outside of looking cool, which, you know, isn't the worst thing in the world to put in a video game. That baked-in lag I mentioned earlier most definitely applies to the combat, so have fun with that, but in all honesty, this game's sort of hard to talk about. Sure, it's bad, but it's not the kind of bad you can make jokes about without exaggerating. It more sits on the territory of bland bad, where the mechanics aren't implemented well enough, and the game really never gives you any reason to be interested in it. You only have a single life to finish the game, which means every run is a 1cc, and it can be incredibly difficult. After dying my first time, I dropped the difficulty slider down to easy and made it maybe 3 or 4 screens further than when it was on normal. So don't expect to see the ending of this one without spending a substantial amount of time on it, and I want to be very clear here, at no point would I recommend doing that. Okay, so brass tacks time. The Crow is a shitty cash-in meant to capitalize on a movie release. We've all seen this before, and this one is about as bad as you would expect. If you ask me, sitting there watching footage of this game being played is way more fun than actually playing it, so maybe skip this one unless you're really into badly compressed pre-rendered backgrounds, or I don't know, you have a fetish for guys in leather doing backflips, which, by the way, no judgments.
Wait, take it easy. It couldn't be helped.
And now, my friends, we get into the territory of the truly weird, and in the context of this list so far, that's really saying something. Phase Paradox is a PS2 title made as a direct sequel to a multiple perspective spaceship shooter that you've likely never even heard of called Philosoma, which is pretty insane given the gameplay style this game's going for. I can tell you right now, this is very much not looking to follow in the footsteps of its predecessor, as it is an almost entirely story-driven video game, and I don't mean that story drives the game forward. I mean a majority of the time you're going to spend with this one will be watching the story play out. So that being the case, what kind of story can we expect here? Well, Phase Paradox takes place directly at the end of Philosoma, where the setting of that game has essentially blown up. In this sequel, you play as a trio of characters who were all stationed on the giant cruiser sitting just outside the planet. In the intro, the explosion, debris, and shockwaves from the end of Philosoma have reached the ship, and on top of killing off a large number of its crew, has caused some kind of phenomenon where the remaining inhabitants have started attacking people like some kind of low-rent zombie outbreak. Your 3 characters not only span the spectrum of archetypes, but also the spectrum of timelines. You'll be seeing these events taking place before, during, and after this massive explosion, and the goal is not only to keep these people alive, but also to figure out what the hell is going on around here. Some questions you have may include, but aren't limited to, why is the main character from the previous game being held in some kind of cryogenic pod? Why is the crew going insane and killing people? And how is it possible that every voice actor is recognizably from some kind of early 2000s anime?
Maybe he just fainted, but we can't very well move him now. We have to call for help and get some backup sent over here.
Like I said before, this game is less game and more interactive movie, and I know that's going to be a turnoff for some, but this is honestly a really cool watch. You may argue that what separates video games from cinema is the interactive element, and they do have you covered there. You'll have short sections where you're tasked with getting your character from one spot to another on the map, but during that process, I'll be honest, you'll be triggering cutscenes that will make up a majority of your experience. On the plus side, those cutscenes aren't entirely a passive affair. You'll need to make decisions during them, and while making the wrong one could lead to a game over like you might expect, it could also alter the story in some ways. Some of these moments are set to a time limit, and in some games that can be okay, but I think there's just not enough time to properly deal with this without blindly guessing, so prepare to play through some parts multiple times. I'm gonna level with you guys. At first this sounded like a unique but ultimately boring approach to making a video game, but I was genuinely wrapped up in phase paradox by the time the intro was over. I really and truly wanted to see this mystery solved, and the characters, while not the most well-written things in the universe, all seem to have understandable goals and motivations. This might be the most story-filled experience I've ever had with a video game, Metal Gear titles very much included, and I did not expect to like that so much, but I really did. And all of that's well and good, but I assume a lot of you have one question on your minds, and it probably concerns the massive elephant in the room. This game being a Japan-only release, well, how the hell is anyone who doesn't speak Japanese expected to enjoy its story? And I do have some good news on that note. A majority of said story is delivered through an all-English voice cast, so that should be no issue for 95% of your playthrough.
Hey, hold your fire! Don't shoot!
No! Don't come in here!
That being said, you are still going to have to do a little reading, but if you ask me, that's an issue pretty easily solved. First off, there are most definitely playthroughs of this game on YouTube if you're looking to go that route, but if you're not, most of the text in-game is made up of hiragana and katakana with very little kanji used, so if you're a light reader like me, you might be able to work your way through a lot of it. Even very simple knowledge of key ground-level concepts like positives, negatives, places, simple verbs, conjugation, and a small amount of vocab will definitely get you moving most of the time, but it is insane to expect even a fraction of you guys to have previous knowledge of 2 foreign alphabets. And in that very understandable case, I can confirm using Google Translate as a tool during gameplay is pretty damn easy. It can be buggy, but you should have no issues making out what's going on and what each choice entails. Speaking on those choices, making some of them may lead to a quick death, which isn't a terrible idea, but having those deaths exist in a game that's mostly cutscenes that can't be skipped, well, that does tend to sting a bit. On the plus side though, these moments only ever give you 2 options, so you really can't mess these parts up more than once. Other than that, the game uses a lot of survival horror tropes, which you guys know I love. And might I add, seeing pre-rendered backgrounds on a PS2 game is massive enough to get me to sit up and take notice, but using them in a non-survival horror game that includes no actual combat, well, now you have my full attention. Movement is handled without tank controls, and if you ask me, that was a mistake. The rapidly switching camera angles will often reorient your analog stick, which will have you turn in totally different directions a lot. But since you don't really need to control your characters very often, I don't think this will bother anyone too much. And since all the threats you're going to face will only exist in cutscenes, you really aren't going to need to be too nimble, so no harm, no foul. I know I keep saying this in this series, but this one specific title is definitely the most interesting game we've covered so far. A story-only video game is odd enough on its own, but one that looks and plays a lot like a survival horror title, well, that's really something. And of course, the fact that it tells a genuinely cool story is very much icing on that cake. And having said that, I hope it's obvious, but I would absolutely recommend this one. The Japanese text may be a deterrent for some, and I totally get that, but trust me when I say that this is the most playable Japan-only title in existence. The gameplay may be almost non-existent, but it is engaging enough that you do feel like you have control over what's going on screen, and the cutscenes set up this great little mystery that flirts equally with sci-fi, disaster flicks, and horror. So if you have a way to boot backups or honest-to-goodness Japanese games on a real PS2 or an install a PCSX2 on your computer, stop wasting time and jump on this hidden gem. I really think this is going to be something a lot of you are going to get into. Just try to excuse the wimpy laser sounds. Like I mentioned in my Fatal Frame coverage, I've never really been into the traditional Japanese approach to horror. For some reason, I just don't find old Japanese houses to be inherently creepy, and the Japanese take on ghosts just doesn't do it for me. And that being the case, you'd figure a game like Kuon would be a bust for me, but I ended up actually getting a kick out of it. Kuon was created by From Software of all people with the goal of combining survival horror gameplay beats with traditional Japanese ghost stories, and in that sense I'd say they perfectly achieved their goals. The story split up into 2 playable characters and a 3rd unlockable campaign. I went with Sakuya because she has the coolest hair, which, as I'm saying, it seems to be a driving force behind most of my decisions in games. The game mostly takes place inside of Fujiwara Manor, where some kind of demonic outbreak is taking place. Sakuya is part of a team of exorcists that sort of feels like the supernatural equivalent to the STARS team. After not hearing from anyone in the manor for a month, the crew were dispatched to clear up the issue, and, well, that's exactly what they do. Exploring the manor feels reasonably like you'd want in a survival horror game, with multiple rooms to discover and all kinds of locks and puzzles halting your progress until you figure them out. Yeah, things are almost perfect here, except for one glaring flaw that I'm struggling with. The only issue being I'm not sure if it's a just me thing or if it's more of a universal problem. Because old Japanese architecture can be a little, shall we say, repetitive, I found it sort of hard to keep each area memorized enough that I knew exactly where to return to once I came across a key item or something. I would enter an area and assume, well, this is the place because, let's face it, you can only see so many wooden plank floors and open room layouts until they all start merging together in your head. Because of this, I had to check the map a little more than I would have liked to, and since individual rooms aren't included on it, that was a little more obtuse than it really had to be. The game uses a more traditional control scheme, meaning each direction on the analog stick will move your character in that same direction on screen, but since you'll often be running from an enemy to gain ground, then turn around and attack it, this control scheme can be a bit limiting. Turning around requires a buttload of time and a lot of room, so things don't feel as fluid in combat as they should. Speaking of which, you'll be using Yu-Gi-Oh! Spell cards to attack the demons infesting the manor, and it works relatively well. The game does a great job of dealing these spells out in a controlled enough interval that I always felt like I was close to running out, which definitely ties into the more enjoyable parts of survival horror in my opinion. The effects for these spells actually look really cool, but the 2 fire spells sort of look the same and they have the same icon in the menu, so I always had issues mixing them up in my head. Even now, I really couldn't tell you which one's the stronger one and which one was the weaker one. I also had some issues with actually hitting enemies with long-range spells. Once you're sort of facing the enemy, the game will guide your attack to it, but some camera angles make it hard to tell where you're facing, which isn't helped by the stance your character takes when launching projectiles. There are a few different enemy types, ranging from little demon things to ghosts and even possessed people, which complements that Japanese ghost story feel really well. You can handicap yourself by running near an area where a surprise is set, which will have you unable to use spells for a short time. So if you start to hear your heartbeat or things just feel a little creepier than usual, it's a good idea to slow down for a second. As far as gameplay is concerned, Kuon scratches all the itches that a fan of RE-style games are likely to have, but the presentation is a bit of a mixed bag. Right from the start, I thought the game looked pretty good. I mean, it's not the most impressive title on the system, but humans have proper proportions, and there aren't so many effects on screen that it ruins the realistic aesthetic the devs were going for. But the game is just too damn dark for me. It can be really hard to see where you're going until Sakuya gets close enough that her lantern lights things up, which can limit you a bit in the first hour when you're still trying to commit the layout of the manor to memory. I also noticed this game puts out a very thin picture, almost like it's not using the full horizontal space the PS2 is capable of. I've tried looking around and I can't find a reason for this, so if you know, clue me in because I'm intrigued. I'm running my PS2 through my OSSC to get the picture you're looking at, and using a utility called GSM to force what would normally be 480i into a progressive scan picture. And as far as upscaling goes, this game looks great at higher resolutions. The look of the game seems to tread slightly into the realm of a more anime type of presentation, where the faces are concerned at least, which is a look I've always enjoyed, but it is kind of funny seeing a game that has a lot of emphasis on dialogue-driven cutscenes, but doesn't animate any mouths moving. I'm not exactly ragging on From Software over this or anything, but for a game made in 2004, this does feel sort of low effort. Now, I'm sure this was a budget thing because I doubt anyone would do this on purpose, but it is kind of funny that they would do the same thing years later with the release of Bloodborne. Overall, I was impressed by Kuon. There's a lot here for a fan of survival horror, and the 3 playable campaigns certainly bring a lot of value to the table. Combat can be clunky, and the game may be a little too dark for its own good, but none of those flaws were enough to ruin it for me. What did, though, was my lack of interest in this kind of setting. Like I said, I have no idea why, but I just don't find these old Japanese locales very fun to look at. So the game taking place 100% in this kind of world just inherently pulls me out of the experience. I'm not exactly holding that against the game itself, though. Clearly I have some issues to work through, but that doesn't mean this might not be the RE clone for you. In fact, it followed in Capcom's footsteps so well I kept playing past the point I had to, in spite of me not really caring much for the old worn-down Japanese manner. So if you're on the lookout for a game that might fill that Resident Evil-shaped hole in your heart, you could certainly do a lot worse than Kuon. If there are 2 things in this world that I love, it's survival horror style gameplay and a very 90s anime aesthetic. Luckily, I get to talk about both of those things today. A lot of you have been asking me about this one specifically, and even though I've owned it for years, every time I pull it off the shelf, I stop playing immediately, knowing full well this is a game I absolutely have to make a video on, and well, I guess there's no time like the present. TRAG, or as it's known in Japan, Hard Edge, has a very die-hard type of feel to it. The Togusa building has been taken over by terrorists, and you play as an assortment of people trying to put an end to that in one way or another. The first 2 characters we get introduced to are Alex and Michelle, 2 Special Forces members who seem to be the only survivors in their respective units. Later we meet up with Rachel, who's adorable as all hell, and Burns Byford, a detective with a cool-ass necktie, played by a voice actor who might want to read commas a little better.
I'm a local detective. The name's Byford Burns Byford.
This game plays surprisingly like an RE title in a lot of ways. You move around with tank controls and incrementally explore the environment, finding key items and puzzle solutions that'll open up more of the floor plan. Where it really starts to differ is the combat, though. Excluding Alex, all the playable characters specialize in close quarters throwdowns, which actually works out really well. Thanks to the more action-centered nature of the game, you'll notice a very arcadey-style heads-up display, and even though the game never actually tells you about this, there are side-scroller beat-em-up style special moves that can be activated by dashing and hitting attack. These moves will eat up a tiny bit of your health, but to help with that, enemies do tend to leave health boosts on death, which is nice. Attacks can be tweaked with directional buttons, which was something I didn't even know about until my second playthrough, and after having a tough-as-nails time with the first boss on my original go-round, dealing this much damage in a single hit feels amazing. And while fun combat is all well and good, the exploration side of things is also handled perfectly. The game rewards you for snooping around by handing out healing items that can be used with the triangle button, and these little things that permanently boost your HP by a few points. Enemies are all over the place, and fighting them can be fun sometimes, but there is something wrong with it. Technically, I do think there's a cool system running in the background here, but I don't think the PS1 is letting it shine very well. Whenever there's more than one 3D model on screen, TRAG slows to a crawl, and when it does, the window that allows you to input multi-hit combos shortens significantly, meaning you might find yourself doing successive single attacks when you're trying to knock an enemy down with a full combo, which really does suck, but you can do this. So I guess we'll call this one even. At any point you can switch between your playable characters, and to be honest, this switching process is much smoother than I first thought it would be. Sure, there is a little bit of a wait, but it doesn't take nearly as long as you might expect a CD-based game would.
What on earth's going on? Seems the building's been taken over by a bunch of punks.
Each character controls a little differently, which is nice to see, and I think Michelle is my favorite since her run speed is fast and her melee combo is fun to pull off. Then again, Burns over here did suplex a giant robot to death at one point, so safe to say competition's a little stiff. The intro cutscene is just beautifully rendered, and as soon as I saw these characters on screen, I was immediately taken back to my teenage years when making it to a pre-rendered cutscene was like a treat used to reward you for making progress, or at least that's how it felt to me. In fact, I used to pass the video output from my consoles through a VCR so I could record these cutscenes to a VHS tape. I'd rent games from Blockbuster and keep the VCR's controller near me just in case a cutscene started. Come to think of it, I guess this whole capturing footage and obsessing over ports and video quality thing might have all started back then. I still have a few of those tapes laying around somewhere, and it's always fun popping one in and seeing what demo I was recording from or what I thought was important enough to share room on the tape. The in-game character models look amazing with that oh-so-recognizable PS1 polygonal style that had characters looking more like a loose culmination of geometric shapes and less like actual people. A style that might not be the most realistic looking, but most certainly works perfectly with this anime aesthetic. On that same note, the pre-rendered backdrops are just beautifully designed, feeling like a cross between late 80s and early 90s architecture with that Art Deco kind of flair. The voice acting is...
Howdy, birds. Imagine meeting you here.
I mean, do I really need to finish that sentence? It's a PS1 game, how do you think it sounds? On that subject though, I was a little thrown off when Michelle sounded like this in the intro cutscene,
I don't know.
but like this in the rest of the game.
I'll make them pay for what they did to our people.
Not really sure what's going on there. Honestly, TRAG was a really fun time. It did have some very clear flaws, but I didn't feel like they got in the way of the stuff that actually worked. The design and feel of the game world took me further back into my gaming past with each new room reached, and I genuinely had a blast coming across enemies and beating their asses. Movement can be a pain because it's so damn easy to get caught up on the environment or dead enemies before they disappear, but this never got to a frustrating point, just sort of annoyed me every once in a while. If I were you, I'd definitely give this one a shot. It brings over a lot of elements found in Resident Evil, but brings so much of its own personal charm that it doesn't feel as derivative as it may look on the outside. The graphics are a nostalgia trip all their own, and old PS1 era voice acting will always have a spot in my heart. Sadly, it has shot up in price in the last 4 or so years, but with a PS1 ODE like the X Station costing about as much as 2 of these games put together, I think going the optical disc drive emulation approach might be the best bet here. Damn, these used game prices really get up my nose.
People who lie really get on my nerves.
Here's another one of those titles that people have been asking me to cover for years, and despite being a fan of these sort of games, I've only just now played Haunting Ground for this video, and to be totally honest, it's a bit of a mixed bag in my opinion. The story, so much as I've gathered, is about a girl named Fiona who, after getting into some kind of car accident with her parents, woke up in the strange castle. There seems to be someone calling the shots around here who wants to keep her around, but mostly the antagonist comes in the form of this guy, some kind of sloth lookalike who wants to keep Fiona as one of his dolls. In my short time with it, I haven't really discovered much more than that, other than some sort of alchemy bend to things, and I can most certainly give it a thumbs up for getting me interested, but story-wise, this game is a very slow crawl for the first few hours, which certainly isn't a huge issue, but if I'm being totally honest, the gameplay wasn't exactly keeping my interest in the meantime. Now, I know this isn't a popular opinion to have, but I've just never really been into non-combat approaches to horror games. I can't really say why, but I just don't feel as in control of the gameplay when I don't have direct damage dealing options when faced with an enemy. Which is probably a good time to mention the inclusion of a cute little dog named Huey, who plays into the game in a few different ways. When the weird groundskeeper guy is after you, Huey will latch onto him and keep him occupied, but I tried not to do this very much because sometimes the asshole will kick the dog, and that made me feel terrible. On that same note, you can order Huey around with the right analog stick, which will get him to do things like staying put, searching for hidden items, and interacting with the environment. A system I had a lot of fun experimenting with, but there is one option on the stick to scold Huey, and I swear I lived in constant fear of accidentally hitting that during gameplay. Trust me, the last thing I want to do is take part in some kind of dog abuse simulator. Getting Huey to crawl through small openings is kinda cool, but a lot of the necessary uses for the dog do seem a little like padding. You know, things that could have been done myself, but the game forces me to use a middleman anyways. At first, using Huey can be a real pain in the ass as he doesn't listen very well, which is like giving the player an action button that sometimes won't work for no discernible reason. Although I did find giving him near constant pets does help that problem a little bit. There are items that can be found that on top of healing stamina for both Fiona and Huey can be placed as traps for your pursuer, which I guess is okay, but I sort of preferred the method found in Clock Tower 3 where you had a more direct offensive option. Exploration in Haunting Ground for me was the best and most satisfying element. I really liked how creepy the castle is, while still seeming relatively mundane on the surface. There's a creepy atmosphere of dread here, and sometimes I felt like I was in danger just being there. I really did enjoy discovering new areas of the castle that seemed off, but not in any consciously recognizable way. I don't know, there's some kind of psychological thing that triggers in my brain when this kind of stuff happens. The only problem with that is you'll randomly come across this groundskeeper and then either hope there's some kind of event trigger near you or backtrack several areas until you find a hiding place. So it kind of feels like for every 3 steps forward, you gotta take 2 steps back. Man, I can already feel the hate radiating from the comments section. I came into this knowing Haunting Ground had a pretty big cult following, and it's not like there's anything in the game I feel like it particularly did wrong. I just don't enjoy these types of games very much. I can most definitely play something that might be a slow burn, but I'd like to be directly responsible for my well-being in that experience instead of acting through some kind of mediary. And I think it's the combination of that slow pace and the constant threat of the game spawning an enemy that'll force me to abandon my pace of gaining ground that bothers me. I enjoy exploring the environment in games like this, and I think the worst thing a developer can do is put something in the way of that exploration that can't be solved in the same way a puzzle might be. So without a doubt, this is not the experience for me, but I will say it is a damn fine looking title for a PS2 release. I'm using Open PS2 Loader and GSM to force 480p video output, and Haunting Ground really shines in progressive scan. The 3D graphics have a very fine, almost soft look to them with a lack of strong outlines and a use of very subtle colors that aren't garish. It's clear they were going for a realistic approach, which I think worked really well here. The environment has an amazing design to it, with rooms that just ooze personality while staying relatively artistically muted, meaning there's not too many elements that stand out as being particularly attention-grabbing while still being able to keep my attention, which sounds dumb now that I'm saying that out loud. It's clear the in-game cutscenes were mo-capped and really well at that. Plus there's jiggle physics, which if I'm being honest, never stopped being amusing the whole time I was playing. Man, the late 90s and early 2000s was an amazing time for video game graphics. And boobs. If there was one area where I felt like the game stumbled, it would be in the sound department. If you're being chased or watching a cutscene, you can expect some tunes that'll heighten the mood, but outside of that, I hope you're cool with a single moody track that sounds more like ambient droning than a piece of satisfying game music, which is normally something I'm cool with. I mean, you could say the same thing about Resident Evil 2, but here in Haunting Ground, there's just no diversity in the soundtrack. If I remember correctly, there's just one single song that plays when exploring the castle, and that's a shame. So I'm at an odd point here with this, where I actually didn't enjoy the game very much, but I would still recommend it. I mean, it's definitely not my cup of tea, but with so many people recommending it to me, it seems clear I'm the odd one out here. Plus, there were a few elements that I genuinely did enjoy. Now sadly, this is one of those limited releases that commands stupid high prices on the used market, so for this one instance, I would fully endorse emulation or some kind of backup loading as a first and last measure. You can get a lot for $300 to $400, and a single PS2 game just doesn't seem like a good return on investment to me, even if it does have great jiggle physics.
This can't be happening. Not again. Oh yeah, it's happening. It's happening in a big way.
Evil Dead Hail to the King would normally look like your typical cash-in title, except for the fact that there wasn't anything necessarily there to cash in on in the first place. These movies weren't exactly box office moneymakers, mostly because cult followings don't often equal financial success. That being said, it seems like the world and characters from Evil Dead and Army of Darkness would make for a great RE clone, but that's not what we're dealing with here, trust me. Hail to the King starts off as a sequel to the movies that sees Ash coming back to his time period and going back to work while developing a relationship with a fellow S-Mart employee. He's not left unscathed from his run-ins with the demonic though, and has been suffering from nightmares and delusions. So his newfound girlfriend suggests that they go back to the cabin from the first movies in the name of getting some kind of closure, and that goes about as well as you might imagine, with Ash's severed hand showing up and hitting play on the tape recorder again, basically resetting the events from the first movie. So now his girl's missing and he's got a chainsaw for a hand. Problem meets solution.
Groovy.
HTK plays a lot like the survival horror games you might be used to with tank controls and puzzle-driven exploration, but It's the combat where things differ. Instead of holding a button to attack, attacks can be done freely and even while running. Now, if only they worked. Honestly, I just flat out gave up trying to develop any kind of strategy with this one. Sometimes a Deadite would take 4 swings with a chainsaw, and sometimes they'd take more than 12. You can hit R2 to actually turn on the chainsaw, which will be your main method of attack, but thanks to some awful lag, hitting that button just flat out doesn't work sometimes, meaning you'll be sitting there hammering on R2 while enemies are just wailing away at you. Listen, there's no getting around this. Combat in this game feels closer to throwing up while shitting your pants than it does an RE game. Enemies can kick your ass, oftentimes, at the same time you're kicking theirs. These guys just flat out don't seem to understand the concept of hit stun, so expect to take constant damage. They can also spawn right on top of you, which will lock you in place and prevent you from even turning to attack them, and if that weren't bad enough, these assholes seem to respawn infinitely. Sometimes you'll find yourself going long periods of time unmolested by enemies, but I'll be damned if I know why that is. To make up for the absolute garbage that is the combat, enemies will almost always drop healing items, which, if you're lucky, will at least make up for the cheap hits you took while fighting them. So you're probably getting the idea that the combat is whack as all hell, which is true, but we have one question. Is there anything here worth praising? Well, oddly enough, yeah, there is. In fact, it's a lot. The gameplay is more akin to an adventure game than even RE, with puzzle items being found and roadblocks being cleared by their application. I actually found that aspect of the game pretty fun. Solutions to puzzles aren't typically too far away from where you're exploring, and they feel like real-world stuff like clearing a drain to find something that fell into it, or finding a shovel to clear rocks. Another plus and subsequent minus is the fact that pre-rendered backgrounds have a cool design to them, with some of them actually consisting of CG animation. The aforementioned minus being how badly they needed to be compressed to fit on the disc. That being the case, you'll see block boundary artifacts and severe color banding on almost every screen, but I'll be damned if I still don't get a kick out of looking at them. Having Bruce Campbell voice his character's lines brings the expected amount of attitude, and some of his quips can genuinely be funny.
Hey, let's get one thing straight. I don't like being ordered around, okay? You got me, Padre? Padre? Yeah, nice hat.
Oh, and the devs made the triangle button trigger a random taunt, which makes me wish they showed that same kind of care in designing the rest of the game. Enemy designs can be pretty bland, but there was this one area where I had to help an old woman lying in her bed, only to eventually find out the bedpost were legs and she was just some deadite spider thing. Not too shabby if you ask me. Boss fights are about as polished as the regular combat, read not at all, so expect to just sit there trading blows with some of your attacks actually registering damage and some not for whatever reason. Having to constantly maintain fuel for your chainsaw was actually kind of fun to manage if only turning the damn thing on and off was reliable, and it seems odd they had a limited inventory when the game just doesn't play to that element very well. Items are dropped by enemies on death, so conservation isn't a factor here, which makes me wonder why they just haphazardly implement something like a limited amount of inventory slots if items and enemies respawn anyways. To be totally honest, I was looking forward to overreacting to this game's clear lack of developmental talent like some kind of YouTube hack, and it did piss me off to the point where I just stopped playing it one time, but there's also something going on here that actually works. With all the same elements but a team that knew what the hell they were doing, I could see this becoming a hidden gem, but as it is, it's far too flawed for me to even remotely recommend, despite the fact that I may hate-love it. Very not groovy if you ask me.
All right, lady, you got yourself a deal. But I swear, any one of your boys gets near me, I'll turn him into furniture. Got it?
I could be bounded in a nutshell, and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams.
In covering these Resident Evil clones, a portion of my goal was to cover a few games that had been sitting in my collection unplayed because I knew I was interested in trying them out but wanted to wait till I was going to produce a video about them. And in that category, Martian Gothic was king. I mean, a game that has a group investigating a Martian outpost filled with zombies and other supernatural phenomenon. It sounds like a home run to me, and in a lot of ways it is, but I'm sad to say this might be one of, if not the most disappointing games on this list. Not so much because of how bad it is, but more so because of how much better it could have been. Martian Gothic is a relic of an older school of retro PC game design where the main goal is centered around solving puzzles and not so much about mechanically engaging with a video game. And with this adventure game logic cranked up to the max, I doubt very much a majority of people will be able to progress more than 15 or 20 minutes into this game without a guide, which is a massive disappointment because everything about this game has the potential to make me love it. Speaking of which, Martian Gothic starts off with one hell of an interesting setup. A group are on their way to a settlement called Vita 1, a base on Mars that has gone radio silent since about 10 months ago. The last actual communication received from the place included a warning that simply said, "Stay alone, stay alive." Now, as far as openings go, this is one of the more well-done examples of pulling a player in that I could list. Right from the start, we have the plot of the movie Event Horizon with a few of the key points switched around. The idea of Martian mysteries that might include forbidden knowledge and cosmic horror is permeating the entire intro cutscene, and gameplay seems promising from the start as well. You have a total of 3 characters to swap back and forth with, and each one is selectable from a menu. The swapping process is easy to use and takes no time at all to up and switch to a new character in a totally different part of the base. Movement is a huge issue though. Now don't get me wrong, you know I love tank controls, but these just were not working for me. Characters control sluggishly and with a bit of lag, and turning while running is only an option on the most wide of paths. Mostly you'll be stopping to adjust your angle and then running again, which does kind of take away from the pace. But in all honesty, this isn't the worst deal breaker ever. What is though is what I consider gameplay so obtuse that I struggle to believe anyone sat down and figured this stuff out unassisted. The first room in the game can be easy enough to wrap your head around. There are only 2 examinable objects in the room, and taking/using one of the items in the helmet will see each character getting in touch with each other over the radio. As you continue, you find you won't be able to proceed with 2 characters until the third one is able to open a door for them. So you run around what is a great looking environment and eventually find a computer, and again this is pretty straightforward. There are a few bodies on the ground near here, so you search them and find an item that'll grant you access to the computer, which will open the door. But it's here where things start to really break down. Now the explorable environment has grown substantially, and there are 2 more playable characters, which further multiplies things. And my issue with this is there are a lot of resources scattered around that can be collected but can't be used yet, and locks and interactive objects that can't be utilized till much later. So when it comes time for a little trial and error, you're left with far too many options, which might not be as big of an issue if running from one area to another wasn't handled with the slowest and worst feeling controls I have ever used. On top of that, transitions between camera angles can take a very long time, and sometimes you can trigger them accidentally. In fact, I'd say most of the time. So the game pushes you to explore and try things out, but makes it incredibly annoying to do so. And further on top of that, things need to be done in a very specific order. For example, going into this room and searching a corpse can trigger an event where that corpse gets up to attack you. The only issue being, so far in the game, you have yet to come across any means to defend yourself and maybe one healing item. And sure, this may seem like an isolated incident, but trust me when I say the entire game is just a series of these events going back to back. In this way, the game effectively makes itself uncompletable if you do things out of order, and believe me, it is not an order that will appeal to normal human intuition. Once you do get your hands on a gun, combat isn't the best, and at one point my character got stuck holding the gun and couldn't put it down. The controls that used to aim up or down moved me back and forth, and every single button on the controller either fired the gun or did nothing, which was just a joy to experience. Okay, I'm not going to sugarcoat things, I gave up on this one pretty early on. It is frustrating as all hell, and I got the feeling that the game was designed to be restarted over and over again until the correct order of events was memorized, and I don't see that as an effective method of game design. Dark Souls. Okay, I'm like 50% joking, please don't burn my house down. What really pisses me off though is that I didn't want to stop. The game's story, setting, and overall feel were through the roof. I mean, I've never been so damn excited to solve a game's mystery, and now I feel like that's all wasted on a title that wanted to gain nerd cred in the adventure game community by being so damn difficult, it's essentially unbeatable without a guide. And again, all of the game design failings wouldn't be so bad if the act of exploration or trying new stuff out wasn't directly brought down with the game's horrible controls, slow pace, and the fact that it punishes you for playing it anyway except how the creators envisioned. I mean, I looked up the guide and you can most certainly complete the game, but only if you go about it in the most oddly specific way imaginable. Deviating from that path may have zombies spawning in a room where you need to grab an item, and this is before you ever get your hands on a healing item. That's just inexcusable in my opinion. Guys, genuinely, I wanted so bad to figure out why these zombies are here and what's going on with the game, but I genuinely don't think I ever will. I'm not going to respect a game that doesn't respect my time, and I really wish I didn't have to say that. This one really upset me because there's an amazing experience, world, and story under here, I can tell. It's just buried underneath an awful mess of game design that seems so amateur. I was genuinely blown away when I found out these guys had made games prior to this. Maybe one day I'll come back to this one with a guide in hand and try to suffer my way through it, but I can promise you that will not be anytime soon. Man, talk about wasted potential.
By coming in through separate airlocks. Stay alone, stay alive. That's what we were told, and that's what we've done.
Now this one is a title I wasn't even sure belonged here. I mean, when the creator of the original Silent Hill works on a project, it's easy to assume it's going to be in the same genre, and broadly speaking that may be true, sort of, but if we're being real here, this shares almost none of the characteristics that I would expect from either Resident Evil or Silent Hill. My insanely stringent standards aside, I don't think letting Keiichiro Toyama get grandfathered into this list is going to hurt anyone, in fact it may help. And on that note, Siren is something truly unique. It takes place in a rural Japanese area that has just suffered an earthquake, one that ranked high on both the Richter and supernatural scales. It seems like a religious cult has had their hands in this event, and after the shaking stopped, some weird stuff started going down as well, like all the bodies of water turning red and people turning into mindless creatures looking to kill anything not like them. You experience what I can only loosely call a story from several perspectives, and I say it that way because this is less of an actual story and more of a series of events that a group of 10 or more people went through. Story events are presented out of chronological order, so your first time through you aren't going to have the slightest idea of what's going on, and to be fair, there isn't much of these cutscenes to be able to tell you anyways. Sure, watching them in the right order may reveal who's who, but they aren't going to outright make any real explanations, or at least they didn't for me more than halfway in. And with the game's creator being who he is, I don't think it's going to surprise anyone that gameplay is just about as odd as the approach to the story is. Technically, we're playing a horror stealth game here. Actual means to defend yourself are few and far between, and even when you get your hands on some kind of weaponry, well, you're not exactly a force to be reckoned with. So I guess sneaking it is. The act of evading enemies isn't handled in any way you're likely to be used to. No radar to show patrolling bad guys or anything like that. Instead, you use the sight-jacking system, something that lets you see through a person's eyes. And I have no problem saying that this was a really damn refreshing mechanic to get used to. You have to sneak your way around the environment and hit the L2 button, which will let you scan for nearby lines of sight to tap into like some kind of supernatural radio dial. You move the left analog stick in any direction till you get a hit, and then you can assign that perspective to a button like triangle, square, circle, or X. That way you can quickly swap between patrolling enemies instead of looking for them all over again. Now, once you start looking through someone else's eyes, you can track your own position on screen with this nifty little indicator. This system can actually be used in a pretty damn wide variety of unique ways. Things like using a flashlight or making noise around one of these insane people can draw them to your position, so you can get to a corner, start sidejacking them, and wait till they've turned their back to make your move. Or sidejack a bad guy with a gun, waiting till he needs to reload before running in and bludgeoning him. At first, I thought this was going to be a hard mechanic to keep track of. I mean, just keeping yourself hidden can be a chore, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to swap between all these different pairs of eyes and how instinctive it becomes. And as I'm actually saying this out loud, it sounds pretty insane because we have first-person and third-person perspectives in video games, but now we are using someone else's first-person perspective to see us in the third person, which I think adds up to the fourth person if that's how math works. Either way, this was a really fun and unique mechanic that was intuitive enough, but also so far outside the box that it kind of blew me away when I used it. Very much a thumbs up from me. Combat's handled in the typical survival horror method with R1 readying and the action button doing the deed, but with how slow and unwieldy this is, you won't be relying on it much, even when you come across a gun. The game does a great job of slowly introducing new challenges, making sure you don't just ghost every mission by making a mad dash to the end, but that's where one of my chief complaints actually starts. Each mission has you completing a main or sub-goal, but that one area is always going to be relatively small. This, added with the segmented nature of the gameplay, which has you taking up a different character each new mission, makes the game feel more like a spreadsheet than a single cohesive experience. And I know that sounds really dumb, but to be fair, there is an actual spreadsheet that tracks your in-game progress, so maybe I'm right? If I could make one change, it would be to have a single perspective to view the story from with a singular start-to-finish type of layout, because going from one area to the next doesn't really feel like progressing through an interesting setting here, but instead like an old video game where you start and finish different levels with different themes. I guess what I'm saying is I would have liked more of the connective tissue between areas to have felt something more akin to Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but that being said, this is a guy who's known for his creativity, and I doubt purposely emulating previous works is ever going to be his main goal. Although I can take solace in the fact that the dev team were able to implement tank controls effectively in a game that's controlled primarily with an analog stick. Except there is one issue there. It uses a method that has you sneaking when the stick is slightly pressed and running when held all the way in one direction. The only issue being I often overshot that run-walk barrier when an enemy was around, and I was a little more prone to squeezing my controller a little harder, which certainly may be an issue specific to me, but something worth keeping in mind. As you may have noticed by now, the faces are a little off looking, and as a matter of fact, this is what really stuck out for me when I rented Siren as a teen. They essentially went for that Max Payne look by wrapping actual pictures of the actors' faces around a 3D model, and as you can see, they pretty much used a few interpolated frames as an animation when switching from one expression to another. And if I'm totally leveling with you, it is very off-putting, but to be fair, in a game with this kind of subject matter, given the context of the person who made it, it seems to be right at home, really. As far as the 3D stuff goes, this is a great looking PS2 game. Environments are absolutely stunning to look at, and the fact that you'll have your flashlight off most of the time makes them all the more creepy. While I myself haven't ventured too far into the Japanese countryside, I have gone as far as Hakone, and it's cool seeing that similar small village vibe here. And on a note that I don't think anyone cares about, the menus are really sharp looking too. For such a dark and dreary game, there's a lot of colors and modern looking angles to the menu system, and normally I'd say this would clash visually, but to me it seems to fit right in. I don't really know why. Because this is a 480i game and I couldn't get it working with GSM, I had to use the FrameMeister for deinterlacing, which to my surprise didn't show very much visual noise at all, but it did keep dropping sync during the transition from gameplay to cutscene, although I can't be sure if that's not just my capture card, so if you are planning on using a scaler, you might want to go with the OSSC or RetroTink 2X. Well, it had been more than a decade since I last played this game, and truth be told I had mostly forgotten about it, but it had no issues dragging me right back in for this video. Now, it's certainly not perfect. The trial and error nature of the environmental puzzles can feel very harsh when exploration is punished by roaming bad guys who can get back up after a while of being knocked out. And when guns get introduced, the game turns into a fun system of tracking your many deaths until you eventually try the right order of actions at the right time. But all that aside, this is one effectively scary game. Seeing through the enemy's eyes and hearing their blood-curdling moans and breathing just hits all the right triggers for me. Plus, it's a very Silent Hill sort of small-town environment, which always lends itself to creepiness. Flat out, make sure you play this one. It's one of the most unique looks at horror game design I've seen in quite some time, and it has certainly made a fan out of me. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I think for the next and final installation in this project, I'll include some of the stuff people have been hammering me over, even if it doesn't exactly fit my strict definition of what an RE clone is. If you're looking to help fund more projects like this, I have a Patreon and merch available, and if you're looking for more videos like this, I'll have some linked on screen. Well, you guys rock, and I hope you have a good one. Peace out.